Hi, my name is David, and this is my presentation. There it is. So I did my presentation over the topic of feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. And I just wanted to start off with a little overview of the process of gametogenesis, just because hormones and its feedback loops play a big role in this process. And I'll start off with that gametes are produced by both the testes and ovaries. Gametes are pretty much haploid cells that unite in sexual reproduction in order to form what's called a zygote. And sperm is produced by the testes, and eggs are produced by the ovaries. And eggs are very large and they're very non-motile, which means they aren't able to move. And so the only way they can move is through the means of muscular contraction or cilia. But on the other hand, sperm is very small and very motile, and they're able to swim up the female reproductive tract in order to fertilize an egg to form what's called a zygote, which we talked about earlier. And so gametogenesis is pretty much different for each gender. The process and its timing is different. Women are all born with all the eggs or oocytes they'll ever have, whereas men can, continuously make sperm after puberty. Sperm production and testosterone levels decrease as you get older for men, but that's not the same for women. However, after about the age of 40 for women, reproductive cycles stop, and so those are pretty big differences between the two genders. And as you can see from the picture, this is a pretty good representation of the difference in sizes between sperm and the egg. Egg being this very giant circular cell, whereas a sperm, you can see they have little flagellas or little, projections that helps them swim up the reproductive tract. And this is a continued overview of gametogenesis. This we'll be talking about the actual process of it. And the first bullet point tells us the whole overview of the process, but I just want to say that for each gender there are different steps. There are specific steps for each gender. So first, germ cells in the reproductive tract undergo continuous mitosis in order to increase its numbers. Now it's also important to note how many chromosomes are at each step for each cell. And so right now we are at 46 chromosomes, or 2N, N representing 23. And when they are ready to undergo meiosis, they are now called primary spermatocytes or oocytes. And during this first meiosis phase, the chromosomes duplicate, so each primary spermatocyte or oocyte now has 92 chromosomes, or 4N, 4N. And then they go through the first meiotic division to form two secondary spermatocyte or oocytes, each with now 46 chromosomes. And then these secondary spermatocytes or oocytes then go through another meiotic division, resulting in two haploid gametes, each gamete having 23 chromosomes. And for each secondary gamete, you now have either a sperm or an egg. And as I said earlier, the process is very similar, but it's a bit different for each gender, and we'll be getting to that a little later, or actually the next slide. And the pictures shows a pretty good representation of what goes on in this process of gametogenesis for both male and female. And so now we'll be looking at the male, specifically the process of gametogenesis for males. And so at birth, the gonads are in a state of what's called quiescent, which pretty much means inactive. And at that point, they only contain immature germ cells until puberty. So during the child phase and above, all the way up to puberty. And then at puberty, germ cells undergo mitosis, And at that point, when they're ready, they're now called spermatogonia. And these spermatogonia, they have two options: to either go through and continue the process of mitosis, or they're chosen to go through the process of meiosis. If they're chosen for the process of meiosis, they're now called primary spermatocytes, as we mentioned earlier. And these primary spermatocytes divide into two secondary spermatocytes, and then each secondary spermatocyte then splits off into two spermatids. And each spermatid, like I said earlier, with the haploid cells, each one contains 23 single chromosomes. And so, as these spermatids continue to mature and develop, they then turn into what we now know as sperm. And so this process is pretty simple and straightforward, very similar to the process we talked about in the previous slide. But for females, this is when it gets a little bit complicated. But for the most part, for the beginning part, it's a bit similar. And so just like as we said with the spermatogonia, these germ cells are called oogonias, and these are germ cells in the embryonic ovary. And I want to mention first that this process, because they develop all the eggs as when they're born, this process develops when they're in that embryonic stage. And so oogonias are germ cells in the embryonic ovary, and by the 5th month of fetal development, these oogonias stop mitosis and DNA duplication stage of meiosis, and this results in primary oocytes. And then this continues all the way up to puberty, where these primary oocytes split off into one big egg, which is also called the secondary oocyte, and the first polar body. And this is when it kind of stems off from the first process, because now we have an egg and a polar body, which we haven't seen yet. This first polar body pretty much just disintegrates, and now we're just stuck with the big egg, or what we call the secondary oocyte. And so the polar body is much smaller, but in size, but they both contain the same amount of chromosomes, which is 46. And so at ovulation, if the secondary oocyte is chosen, it has many options or many roads that it can follow. But if it becomes fertilized, if sexual intercourse occurs, you end up with one fertilized egg with 46 chromosomes, one from both the mom and dad. And there is a second polar body, which disintegrates just like the first polar body. And however, if the secondary oocyte does not get fertilized, it instead releases from the ovary in the process called ovulation, and pretty much meiosis never happens, and the egg just simply disintegrates. So it's a similar process, but it's a little complicated because there's so many directions in which the primary oocyte can go through, just depending on if you have sexual intercourse, if the egg becomes fertilized, whatnot. And so now we'll be talking about hormones, because like any other process, hormones is what controls this process of gametogenesis, and it is the focal point of this PowerPoint, in which we'll be talking about the feedback loop. And so peptide hormones from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland is what controls gonadal secretions, and these include androgens, estrogens, and progesterone. And I want to say that both sexes produce all three. That's a misconception that people kind of don't understand, because we think of androgens coming from men, estrogen and progesterone coming from women, but in reality, both sexes produce all three. Testosterone comes from the testes. Testosterone is converted to what's called DHT, which is a more potent derivative of testosterone. That's when pretty much all the male sexual characteristics are developed from. And estrogen and progesterone are from the ovaries. And as I said before, both sexes make all three. And Now we'll talk about gonadotropin releasing hormone, in short GnRH. This is released from the hypothalamus, which then stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And FSH and the steroid sex hormones, they both act on the gonads, and they control gametogenesis, whereas luteinizing hormone acts on the endocrine cells and controls the release of sex hormones. Now, this is a continuation of hormones, but these are also facts that have been discovered in recent years. But kisspeptin is a hypothalamic neuropeptide that controls the regulation of GnRH. And now there's also a feedback system that goes to the brain, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But gonads also have a self-feedback system in which it stimulates itself pretty much. The gonads secrete peptide hormones that go directly to the pituitary instead of the brain acting down. And so we'll start off with inhibins, which inhibit the secretion of the follicle stimulating hormone, activins, which stimulate follicle stimulating hormone, and AMH, which is pretty important for sexual differentiation for cells. And all three of these hormones all come from the beta family. Now, for the most part, feedback pathways follows a negative feedback loop. This pretty much means when gonadal steroid levels are low, this stimulates the pituitary to secrete FSH and LH, or it stimulates the hypothalamus to secrete GnRH, which stimulates the pituitary to secrete FSH and LH. And so for men, for androgens specifically, it follows this simple negative feedback loop where if the androgen levels are low, it would stimulate the secretion of FSH and LH. However, for estrogen, it's a little bit different because estrogen can either have both a positive or a negative feedback loop. If there's low levels of estrogen, there is no feedback effect. If there's moderate levels of estrogen, it has a negative feedback effect. But the ironic thing is, if there's high levels of estrogen and if it stays at that threshold for at least 36 hours, it would turn from having a negative feedback to having a positive feedback. And so having a positive feedback would stimulate the release of gonadotropins. So it's pretty ironic. It's a pretty opposite feedback loop when comparing it to androgens. And so because of that, it is a very complicated process, very complicated feedback loop when comparing it to females and males. And because it's so complicated, it's still not really fully understood. And this concludes my presentation.